Massachusetts has done two different models of state law so far. First, a declaration that, I guess, the ADUs, there was not necessarily the same kind of reporting back and verification as there is with the MBTA Communities Act. Is one better than the other? Well, I just showed you the ADU provisions in local law. They're not going to necessarily get updated. So how do we break this logjam? And this potential that we break the logjam with a totally different model of zoning than 352 different jurisdictions.
So I want to welcome you all today to Suffolk University Law School for the launch of the Massachusetts Zoning Atlas. My name is John Infranca. I'm a professor of law here at the law school. I teach classes predominantly in the areas of property, land use, and local government law. And I'm going to start us off by talking a little bit about Suffolk's role in helping to produce the Atlas, share my own motivations for getting involved in this project, and then talk a little bit about my hopes regarding its ability to contribute to efforts to address the housing crisis here in Massachusetts. I'll then turn things over to Sara Bronin, the founder and president of the National Zoning Atlas, who will explain how the Atlas functions and how it can be used, as well as share some key findings about zoning here in the Commonwealth. We'll then have some brief comments from Jesse Kanson-Benanav and from Linke, who will discuss how policymakers and advocates on the state and local level can use the Atlas in their work, and then we'll leave some time for conversation, and I hope that those of you who can will stay and continue the conversation. So for those who have not yet explored the National Zoning Atlas, it's an online interactive map that illustrates zoning regulations across the country. It started with the Connecticut Zoning Atlas in 2021, when Sara worked with a team of advocates to read 32,000 pages of zoning codes and explore how the nutmeg state regulates land use. As more people got interested in bringing atlases to their own community, Sara took on the ambitious task of creating a zoning atlas that would cover the entire United States. In 2022, she invited me to assist with the effort here in Massachusetts. With financial support from the Marquita Center, I hired nearly 20 Suffolk University law students, many of whom are now graduate and in this room. If you want to raise your hand, if you're someone who worked on the Atlas, there's a few students here who worked on the Atlas, to obtain the zoning maps and text for every jurisdiction in Massachusetts, read through that text, and then code over 100 zoning requirements for every district in the state. The students were assisted by a number of external volunteers and by a team from ZS Consulting, as well as additional financial support from the Massachusetts Association of Realtors, from the Bar Foundation, and from the Faculty Initiative Fund here at the law school. In addition to helping build the Atlas, our students deepened their understanding of local land use regulations, and a number of those students now play roles at local real estate law firms and at the Massachusetts Land Court. It's my ambitious hope as a law professor that in the next 10 to 20 years, those students will solve our housing crisis here in Massachusetts. No pressure. So last year, we handed responsibility for completing the Massachusetts Zoning Atlas over to the National Zoning Atlas team, which now has 28 full-time employees working through an independent not-for-profit. So why spend 3 years creating a zoning atlas for Massachusetts? I suspect nearly everyone in this room is aware of the housing crisis facing our Commonwealth. Housing costs and rent prices continue to rise, outpacing wages, due in significant part to a lack of sufficient supply. The governor's recent statewide housing plan found that the state needs to increase its housing supply by at least 222,000 units over the next 10 years. And despite recent legislation, like the MBTA Communities Act, we are still very far from meeting that goal. And we are also far from implementing the types of reforms needed to make this level of housing production even possible. Zoning regulations contribute to this lack of housing supply. They often ban the type of housing, like multifamily housing, that is most affordable, or they make such housing hard to build, making developers go through lengthy discretionary processes. Zoning codes are also really complex, sometimes hundreds of pages long. The Zoning Atlas confronts this complexity. It provides the general public, advocates, and policymakers with a powerful tool for understanding and for visualizing zoning and how it shapes our built environment and the communities we live in. The Atlas also helps us understand how various regulations interact and to recognize and target where reforms are needed. It's my hope that, as it has done in other states, including our neighbors Connecticut and New Hampshire, as well as states out west like Montana and Colorado, that the Massachusetts Zoning Atlas will inform our discussions about reform and improve them. It's my pleasure now to introduce Sara Bronin. Sara is the founder and president of the National Zoning Atlas. She's also a law professor at George Washington University. She's the author of the book Key to the City: How Zoning Shapes Our World. And she's been a reformer and change maker, chairing the Hartford Planning and Zoning Commission and serving in a presidentially appointed Senate-approved role, chairing the Federal Historic Preservation Agency. So now I'm going to turn it over to Sara.
So thank you, John, for hosting us today. Thanks to Suffolk Law School. And it has been such a pleasure to work with John on actually a number of different initiatives throughout our respective professorships. But if you have not explored his scholarship, it's first rate. It's all about zoning, not all, a lot about zoning, and you can find it at SSRN. I just want to put a big plug in for John as a scholar and a leader in this, and also thrilled to see some of your students here. We have depended a lot on students over the years, including to help build the first atlas in Connecticut. And as a professor like John, I really appreciate their raising their hands to pitch in. I also want to recognize a couple of folks in the audience that are on our team. Sitting here in the front row, good job, you guys, are Jake Gilbert, who's in the middle here, who actually worked as a GIS analyst on Massachusetts when we picked it up from John's team. Natalie Gilbert, no relation, who works on the National Preservation Atlas, a project that we are initiating and is online at preservationatlas.org. If anybody's curious as to how we're framing that, are both also on our GIS side of the house. And we're also joined by Alec Rade, one of our affiliates as well. So with that, I'm going to start with the Massachusetts Zoning Atlas presentation. As John said, we have relied significantly on a number of partnerships in the state. I will, in addition to thanking the folks he thanked, also single out the Bar Foundation, whose support really helped us to finish our part of the Atlas over the last year or so, as well as the Massachusetts Association of Realtors. We've been working with realtors groups around the country, so we were really grateful for their contributions. So the contents of this report: first, why the NZA; second, how it's made; third, I'm going to give a very quick primer on how to use the NZA. Then we'll look at how Massachusetts zones, and then what's next for the Massachusetts Zoning Atlas. So why the National Zoning Atlas? John summarized our work pretty well, but we have this tagline: we're digitizing, demystifying, and democratizing information about zoning. So as he pointed out, it's all in an online map. We tried to do this so that we can create apples-to-apples comparisons for jurisdictions, so maybe towns can engage in some friendly competition. And I really believe in this democracy, the democratizing part of our mission. And I know Jesse's going to talk a bit about advocates. But if advocates don't have access to information, they really can't inform solutions as easily. I mean, we can all look around and see zoning is not working very well. But the Zoning Atlas will give Jesse's group, so many groups around the country, tools to really articulate why, how, and the particulars. The Zoning Atlas is online. Here's an image of it. It's at zoningatlas.org/atlas. And I'll talk a little bit more about our progress in a moment. But first, I want to talk about how it's made. Just very big picture. What we do first is we identify jurisdictions: cities, towns, counties, villages, basically places with zoning authority. We had somebody comment on a social media post that we had, where we had a 352 number, and they said, well, there's 351 cities and towns in Massachusetts, but there's actually a 352nd zoning jurisdiction. That's the Devon's Economic Zone. It's a special authority that actually has zoning authority, and we only found that because it was a big white spot in the middle of Devon's, and that's kind of how we found in a number of states these non-municipal jurisdictions that have been granted zoning authority. In Massachusetts, your counties don't exercise zoning as they do in some, actually many other states. So we get the jurisdictions, then we look at the zoning districts for each jurisdiction, and we ask questions about these zoning districts, like do they allow residential? What type of district are they? Provincetown had 13 neat districts that could fit on the screen, so you can see the array of districts here. I'll just note there's a seashore district that's common in the seashore, the National Seashore Area. It's something that we'll highlight in a report that's coming out about Cape Cod. But you can see town center, harborfront overlay, general commercial. Districts can come in a lot of different shapes and sizes. There are two components of a zoning code. Most of the people in this room probably know this already, but they are the zoning text and the zoning map. Here is a picture of the town of Sandwich with a beautiful cover to their zoning ordinance, as well as the map. And again, you can see color-coded and divided into districts. That is how zoning works. It's that district scale that really organizes the National Zoning Atlas. So for each district, we look at the text, we look at the geospatial boundaries, the two sides of our team analyze both of that, and then it gets merged into the National Zoning Atlas itself. So that was a very quick overview of how it's made, what we look at, how the back end is organized. And I wanted to provide next just a quick overview about how to use the National Zoning Atlas. So if you are following along on your phone or on your computer at this website, you'll see the national map opened up. And we've labeled here the states that we've completed, 11 states. Much of New England, except for Maine, that is a work in progress. Maine actually has 500 jurisdictions, and it's highly complicated because of shoreland zoning. So we'll put that aside for now, but we've done pretty much the rest of New England and a number of western states, including Alaska and Hawaii. And these are some of the jurisdictions currently in progress. We'll be completing California, Utah, Virginia, and North Carolina this year. We're working in Tulsa. We'll wrap up Atlanta, Northwest Michigan, and a bunch of other places. So just to give you a sense of where we work and where we've been and where we're working now. Overall, that amounts to about 7,500 jurisdictions being posted to the map and 840,000 pages of code read. For those in this room and maybe listening outside of this room today, anybody who's worked on this project knows that each and every page of zoning code is read. That is collectively across our team, because zoning is hugely complicated. You have to cross-reference. There's tables in the back. There's asterisks and footnotes. So we cover a lot of ground when it comes to the text. The places that we've published to the map so far cover about half of U.S. residents and a little over half of land, thanks to Alaska probably. But we're counting it, and we feel like at least it helps us give a sense of progress. So how the atlas works, it opens again at this national scale, and you see at the left different layers. The layer that's really, there's layers that toggle on and off. The base layers are the zoned or unzoned land. And in purple, the zoned land shows you the jurisdictions we've confirmed to have zoning. The gray shows you the jurisdictions that we've confirmed do not have zoning. And you might think, well, proving an absence, how hard is that? It actually does take a lot of time for us to call, especially very small jurisdictions, to confirm whether they have zoning or not. To get the zoning codes, that's another topic. But the toggleable layers on our map are tribal land, protected land, FEMA flood zones, and transit stations. As you'll see later in the presentation, the transit station layer is particularly relevant here in Massachusetts because of recent state legislation involving your transit stations. You can use the zoom and filter functions to zoom to Massachusetts, which we've done here. Oh, and by the way, you see those white dots starting to appear? Those are the transit stations, some of them. And we've decided to zoom in here to Worcester. And at the bottom right, you'll see a little box that appears. And this box has the amount of zone land and the percentage of zone land that meets filtering criteria. We haven't selected a filter here, so it still says 100%. Here at this level, the purples separate into two different types of zoning districts. One is a primarily residential district, meaning residential and not much else. mixed with residential means commercial and residential, or office and residential, in some cases industrial and residential, or a mix of all of the above. And you can see there's that dark purple that's concentrated where the word Worcester is, which presumably is the heart of downtown. The tan areas are non-residential, so a lot of airport lands or industrial lands, sometimes open space only is logged that way. And again, you see the boundaries of Worcester appearing here because we've selected it. Now, this is where the filtering comes in. And again, I'm showing you this so you can see how the map functions. You can explore it later. We've asked where people can build. Show me where people can build single-family homes. And you can see that not much has changed on the map. So just going back to the last slide, pretty much everything that was non-residential is white now. That means it doesn't meet the criteria. So now I'm going to ask the map, where can you build, let's see, what did I ask for? 4-family housing with a minimum parking requirement. So these advanced filters allow us to show where, so the show me where you can actually do 4-family in apartments. Here we've done a little bit more complex, rather than just the show me where. These are the advanced filters. We've asked, where is 4-family allowed as of right? Where is it subject to a minimum parking requirement? And you can see that all of downtown Worcester, and actually in and around there, actually shows up to the amount of 22% of acreage in Worcester allows for 4-family housing. But look at the difference in the surrounding areas, almost entirely white. And this is what you see certainly as a pattern in Connecticut and lots of New England, where the central city allows for lots of multifamily housing as of right, meaning without public hearing requirements or these onerous processes that tend to stall multifamily housing, versus that almost entirely purple single-family housing. Again, this is a very common pattern. So with that in mind, and just having the map in the back of your mind as the ultimate product for people to access, I wanted to go over some of the statistics that we found in Massachusetts. And I'm going to start first with statewide findings. So of that 840,000 pages of codes, a nice healthy chunk came from Massachusetts, with 46,000 pages of codes uploaded to the map for the jurisdictions with zoning. About 5,600 total zoning districts, and a large number of data points for each district. You might have noticed when we zoomed into Massachusetts, a tiny gray spot, and that is Monroe. Monroe is the only jurisdiction in Massachusetts that lacks zoning. There's only 2 in Connecticut that lack zoning, so this is pretty consistent with that. If we saw more of Vermont, you would see there are a few more jurisdictions in Vermont that lack zoning, and New Hampshire as well. But Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island are both essentially entirely regulated by zoning. When we look at when we use the map to calculate the number of acres in Massachusetts, we divide it into land that is zoned. Tribal land, not so much in Massachusetts, certainly a big portion in our western states, and protected land as well as unzoned land. The protected land category includes federal and state lands. The unzoned land category includes rights of way, which we excise from our maps, but are still included in the boundaries. So 76% of land is subject to zoning. That's about the same, again, as Connecticut, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, more or less. It's very different than the western states, where we see 40% in Arizona and Colorado. In Nevada, just 12% of land is subject to zoning. Our map is really helping to paint a picture of these conditions nationally, and so I just wanted to use this slide to show you how Massachusetts sits in context. When you look at that zoned land, it breaks up as follows. 86% is that primarily residential. And you could, again, probably sense this in the communities that you drive in through or live in. Probably much of the land is primarily residential. We're sitting here today in downtown Boston, which is certainly one of that 8% mixed with residential category. And then the 6% non-residential. This is typical for southern New England, this breakdown. Now, this is the chart where things start to get really interesting. This chart shows you the amount of land that is zoned for different types of housing. So when we ask our analysts to log how each zoning district treats housing, They log, does it allow single-family housing as of right? That's that dark blue. Does it log that land after as a special permit required? That's the lighter blue. Or is it entirely prohibited or not mentioned? That's that gray. So 96% of land across Massachusetts allows for single-family housing as of right. We were zoomed into Worcester, but if we had zoomed out further, you would have seen even more of a sea of purple, versus 3.5% of land that allows for 4 or more family housing as of right. The only way to get these numbers, as we talked about before, is to map in very rigorous detail all the zoning districts for all the jurisdictions and to have that text and map match up and align. This is close to what we found in Connecticut, where the statistics were 91 and 2%. So it's a little bit better here, but at least on the multifamily side, but still abysmally small. The light blue, you might say, oh, wow, 36% of land, 38, 39 allows this 2 or more family housing as subject to a special permit. But you can see that there's not a lot of multifamily housing that's been built in that 36, 38, 39% of land, suggesting perhaps that, consistent with research, land that's subject to a public hearing multifamily housing subject to a public hearing probably doesn't get built. As for minimum lot sizes, here is this is maybe something that you might have to look at in addition to right now, because it's just a glance. Our minimum lot size donut. We saw that in the darkest green that about a third of land in the state requires a 2-acre minimum lot size for single-family housing. And if you add in, an acre is still big. If you add in that 46%, you get 3/4 of land requires about an acre of land for each house. So 40,000 square feet. These are really big lot sizes. And again, if you look across the whole state, if that's what we're building in Massachusetts, what we are building is sprawl, land that requires us to move outward into the forests and agricultural lands that I know many Massachusetts residents value, but the zoning is at odds with those values. Parking mandates, so they cover 76% of land. If you look at this filter, housing without parking, you can see that much of the land that doesn't require parking mandates, so requirements that people build parking for units when they build housing. Much of the land that's free of the mandates is in the western part of the state, is in rural areas. So this number on a statewide level may be a bit, maybe too aggregated, but that's why I wanted to show you the map and show you where that actually, where parking is lifted. It does make you wonder why there are parking mandates in some of the other rural and more sparsely populated areas, but that's a question I think we should probably consider in light of these findings. Accessory dwelling units. Here in Massachusetts, as you know, there's a new law that requires towns to allow up to 900 square feet accessory dwelling. So here's a nice graphic from the Massachusetts Office of Housing and Livable Communities. It has special, the law also has rules about the extent to which occupancy can be limited, as well as parking mandates. When we looked at the local laws themselves, we found that this chart was what the local laws on the books say. And what we found was 5% of land allows for accessory dwelling units to be located as of right on single-family land. So this is 5% of single-family land that allows accessory dwelling units. A good chunk of land, that 33%, both 33% actually, have occupancy restrictions that were lifted or largely addressed by that state law. So one thing to observe here is that even though the state statute says something about accessory dwelling units, the local ordinances, at least at the time we logged them, and granted, as John mentioned, this is a multi-year effort, but at least at the time we logged them, they may not have caught up. So it's a flag for all of us to think of how local governments might be tasked with updating their laws and how clear it needs to be for those, at least the 900 square feet or smaller ADUs actually get permitted. Now I'm going to step away from the statewide figures and cut the data a couple of different ways. So our research director, Scott Markley, thought something we did in Colorado might apply well here. There's a census-based methodology that can classify jurisdictions into these 5 categories: rural, small town, outer suburb, inner suburb, and urban core. There's not a large number of small towns here in Massachusetts. Nantucket is one, a couple, Deerfield and Greenfield in the central part of the state. But you see certainly a lot of land that's classified as rural, communities that are classified as rural, and then you see where the urban cores are. In looking at permissions for 4 or more family housing as of right, that to me is a really core number. It tells you where you can build apartments. And again, you can slice this data in so many different ways, but our analysis shows that about 10%, 10.5% of urban core land allows for multifamily housing as of right. So in all these places where you see yellow, there's actually a good chunk of housing that allows for multifamily. You saw that in Worcester. Of course, you see that here in Cambridge, actually, in Boston as well, to some extent. But if you look at outer suburbs, 1.5%, inner suburbs, 2.7%, those 7 small towns, pretty exclusionary, 0.9% of land allowing for 4 or more family housing as of right. And rural land next to the urban core is actually, interestingly, next in line in terms of the percentage of land devoted to 4 or more family housing. I point you again, though, to these light blue figures. This light blue part of the chart is where multifamily housing can be allowed subject to a public hearing. And again, you don't see a lot of multifamily housing that goes through that process. I also wanted to just update you on where we are in logging the updates that local jurisdictions are making in response to the MBTA Communities Act. So again, I'm just honing in here on the 4 or more family housing allowances. I do think, again, it's an important figure. As of today, we've logged 92 communities that have both complied with the MBTA Communities Act and have made their zoning data text and map public. We're still waiting on the others, so this is going to change. And by the way, all of the stats in this presentation are subject to change because jurisdictions modify their zoning rules, or maybe we have a change in interpretation because they say, well, here's the bylaw that also addresses this. So our numbers will always change. As of today, this is what it looks like. MBTA communities log more land devoted to multifamily housing than the state as a whole. And this might make sense, again, looking at that map, since so many of the areas are maybe less populated, maybe less suitable for multifamily land, and the MBTA communities tend to cluster around Boston. But so we looked at that number, but then we logged the before and after. So we were fortunate to have had information about the pre-MBTA communities condition because of the long length of this project. So we looked at the before, we looked at the after, and we found actually that just in those 92 communities as the denominator, there was not actually a really large percentage change in terms of the amount of land that allows for multifamily housing as of right. So again, looking at those blue figures, it went from 6.6 to 7.4% after all of these communities had gone through extensive efforts to undergo rezonings. Statewide, on the plus side, about 5,000, just over 5,000 acres have been rezoned so far, but it has resulted in just a 0.16% increase in residential land statewide for multifamily, 4 or more family allowed as of right. So that kind of begs the question, of course, we don't know the answer to this yet, but it does beg the question, is this law working? I also thought, well, maybe we should look at this at the scale of individual communities, and let's look at it at the winning communities, the top 3 communities that have rezoned their land: Malden, Wellesley, and Arlington. They have had 4 to 5% increases in the amount of land that they've zoned for multifamily housing as of right. By the way, of the 92 towns, 61 increased their absolute percentage by less than 1%. That includes jurisdictions that actually already zone to their credit lots of multifamily housing as of right, Cambridge being the most prominent of these. Rochester does have town-wide multifamily housing, but it is actually capped at 4 units, and it requires owner occupancy. So Rochester's in that mix, but I'll just make that asterisk. Again, Cambridge probably the better example here. New Bedford as well. We were just talking in the hallway about that. 12 of them logged a 0% acreage change, including those 5 towns. They had 0 or again, less than 1% change. But 12 had a 0% change, mostly because they were already in compliance. So now taking those winning communities that rezone the highest percentage of their land for multifamily housing, here's a Malden image before and after they rezoned for the MBTA Communities Act. To comply, they've created 5 new MBTA districts, and you can see where they are on the right. And that has increased the overall percentage of land in the jurisdiction. In these districts, though, again, 5 different districts, there are lot coverage caps of up to 50%, so that means you can only build on 50% of a lot. There's parking mandates across all of them, including one with 2 parking spaces minimum per studio. And there are height caps as well, so you can only build in Oak Grove, for example, a building that's 3 stories tall. So on the plus side, they are said to have been deemed compliant with the law. On the negative side, we still see some of those restrictions that will make multifamily housing a little bit harder to build. When you look at these areas, which you can do on our map because you can toggle to satellite, so you can maybe still see the light purples here, you see some opportunities, parking lots and garages that might result in new housing. But then you also see areas that are rezoned that already have significant developments on them. In Wellesley, they already had 6%, it bumped up to 10%, and they kind of did something I thought more towns would do, which drew a little circle, a half-mile radius around the transit station, and said everything that's in this circle is subject to our new rules. Again, this is pretty good. They actually have pretty light restrictions. The only restriction is a 15 unit per acre density requirement. A couple of spots maybe for development. Again, I'm not an expert in any of these jurisdictions, so this is just going by satellite. On the other hand, a couple of places that are subject to the rezoning that have lots of maybe smaller, medium-sized developments, mostly housing. And then finally, Arlington, which went from 0 to 4%. Again, this is all progress, so I don't want to undermine or belittle the sense of progress that these communities have undertaken. When we look at Arlington's, where they've rezoned, though, there is a 3-story cap, and lots of them are small lots. So for a developer to build multifamily housing here that complies with the cap, you have to assemble properties. And so on the plus side, there are a lot of creative developers out there that might do that. And this development, if they proceeded, would be allowed as of right in these and all the other towns that have changed their rules in accordance with the new state statute. But on the other hand, of course, we know, and just seeing just a few examples on the ground, even the 3 best examples might have some challenges. You can create your own snapshots for any jurisdiction. So those images that I showed you for the state are also online at zoningatlas.org/snapshots. This is what you see, for example, for the city of Worcester, Worcester County, and the Worcester metro area. And just quickly on what's next, coming soon, we hope to release the week of July 28th, the zoning report on Cape Cod. We've been working with the Cape Cod Commission they asked us to do this, and so we are working on that. We are also hoping to start in August a research project that will help to quantify the number of houses that can be built according to the zoning. So using the zoning text, using our lot size data, using all the different elements of zoning that we capture in the zoning atlas, to quantify the amount of housing that can be built. We hope that it will inform planning analysis and legislation, just like we have done in other states, whether it's the Montana Zoning Atlas informing statewide legislation, our two of our other excellent analysts writing something for planners in APA's zoning practice about the significant amount of map to text discrepancies, or our partnerships with other institutions, including the Regional Plan Association, our recent report on sea level rise and zoning in the New York City region. So we hope to not just impact housing, but of course preparations for climate change, transportation, the social and environmental impacts of development, economic growth. My favorite, the food supply. We're still yet to delve into that. But zoning is an extremely powerful force. We hope that we've tried to, through this resource and through our reports and through presentations like these, bring that information to the public. And I think I'm going to stop right there, and feel free to connect with us online, and I'll be back at the end. Thanks, John.
So thank you, Sarah. As Sarah mentioned, one of the ambitions of the Zoning Atlas is to motivate and inform zoning reforms. It's had success doing that already in a number of states. We're going to hear now from two local housing advocates at the forefront of advocating for reforms at the state level in Massachusetts and working with local communities to implement those reforms. If you both want to come up, you can. Jesse Kanson-Benanav is the executive director of Abundant Housing Massachusetts, where he oversees all aspects of the organization's mission to advocate for more housing for all communities in Massachusetts. And Lily Linke is director of municipal engagement for the Citizens Housing and Planning Association, where she oversees the Municipal Engagement Initiative, which works directly with local advocates to build pro-housing coalitions, and the MBTA Communities Engagement Technical Assistance Program, which supports planners in their efforts to implement 3A, as well as a wide variety of educational programming. So we've asked Jesse and Lily to briefly share their reactions to the Atlas and the role they see it playing in their own work, and then we're going to open things up for comments and questions from the audience. But take it away.
Great. Thank you, John. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. And thanks, Sarah, for that great presentation. I appreciate following you, or don't love having to follow that great presentation, but the work that you've done, I know, has been really incredible as the sort of national pro-housing movement has grown, and excited that even this year, the YIMBY Town Conference is going to be hosted in New Haven by Desegregate Connecticut, which is a sibling organization of ours down in Connecticut that came out of your work around the Zoning Atlas in Connecticut. So very excited about that and for that relationship. I think there's so much opportunity to use this tool here in Massachusetts, and my head is just beginning to spin thinking of all the opportunities. I think one of the challenges that we've had for such a long time is that we have 351 different cities and towns, 352 jurisdictions, as we know from Sarah's presentation. They all have their own zoning. Some of these are really small towns. The zoning has been available, maybe in a PDF on the website if you're lucky in some of those cases. Other cases, it's really hard to find, and to have an organization that's done the work and compiled it and visualized it, I think, is really, really powerful. I'm thinking about what are the ways that we can use this in our state level advocacy. The starting point for me right now is that we have made important progress in Massachusetts in recent years on the zoning reform front, from the Housing Choice Law in 2021 to MBTA Communities Act passed at the same time, and more recently the ADU law that passed as part of the Affordable Homes Act last year. This is all really important, but it's not enough. There's a lot more that needs to be done, and there's a lot of work that needs to be done to convince the legislature, legislators, to convince the administration that you need to take what they are perceiving as actual political risks in order to advance the conversation around zoning reform. Many legislators that we talk to just don't even understand the role that their own community or the communities in their districts play in really exacerbating our housing shortage. If their town has a couple of apartment buildings, maybe downtown, or maybe recently approved a development with a special permit or variances, really the assumption is, oh, my community has multifamily housing. We're doing our part. It's the neighboring communities that are the problem. I think this tool really helps us sort of demonstrate to legislators what the true picture is in terms of the types of housing opportunities that are allowed in their communities and the multiple communities often in their districts, where it's allowed, and how their specific community sort of plays a role in the broader picture of where we are as a state and what we are or aren't doing to build enough homes for our residents. So I look forward to using the zoning atlas and the data that we can glean from it in our conversations, my conversations, our advocates' conversations with legislators, to help them understand that full picture of the landscape of where we actually are and how much more we have to do. I know John wanted us to talk briefly. I just, before I turn it over to Lily, want to address MBTA communities a little bit. I think one of the challenges that we've faced in our advocacy for continued zoning reform in Massachusetts is the way that, MBTA communities, the MBTA Communities Act was crafted, which required all 177 cities and towns to go through this affirmative zoning approval process, which we'll hear a little bit more about from Lily. It's really opened up a can of worms in some ways, particularly in that small number of communities that are actively resisting compliance with the law, either in rejecting MBTA community zoning districts at town meeting or overturning it with townwide referenda. And then the media narrative that we hear comes out of that, all right, even if the vast majority of towns are in compliance. But even putting aside that small number of that small minority of actively resistant communities. We've been hearing about this term of paper compliance with the MBTA Communities Act, meaning the adoption of zoning districts that meet the letter of the law and the regulations that implement the law, but as Sara described, are placed over parcels that may not be developable or unlikely to be developed for various reasons. It's a way to say, yeah, we're doing what we're mandated by the state, but we're not actually going to do it in a way that helps get housing built in our community. So this has all posed a problem when it comes to some further discussions around zoning reform in the legislature. Legislators say, look, we tried with MBTA Communities Act and it's unleashed a civil war in my community or in that community over there. Or they say, look, my town or my towns are already in compliance. So we never had by right multifamily zoning to begin with. So mission accomplished, we've done it. I really believe that the data and the way we can visualize the zoning data that Sara presented and it's available in the atlas is going to really help us confront some of these challenging narratives that we confront while talking to legislators about the true impact of MBTA communities, that it is really important, right? Many of these communities never had multifamily zoning to begin with, and we do see a few thousand units that are now in the pipeline that wouldn't have otherwise been built. But we can visualize and tell them now that it's not enough. There's more that need to be done. We can't expect MBTA communities to solve all of our problems. And like I said, in many ways, it's made further conversation about zoning reform in Massachusetts more difficult. So I really look forward to digging into this data, helping our advocates dig into this data and understand how to most effectively use it to convince legislators that the steps we have made are good and important, but there is so much more that needs to be done, and really show them how their own communities are or aren't playing a role in that. There's also still, of course, a role for on-the-ground advocacy and changing the hearts and minds. There are plenty of folks up on Beacon Hill who believe strongly that single-family exclusive zoning is fine. So for them to see that your town only allows single-family exclusive zoning in 99% of it, that's not going to convince them to change. So we have to continue to change hearts and minds, but I think this data and the zoning atlas will really help us get there. So I'll end it at that and turn it over to Lily.
Thanks, Jesse. So as John mentioned, in the program that I facilitate over the last 2.5 years, I've worked with planners in 84 different MBTA communities, specifically with their community engagement efforts in getting these zoning districts passed. And so through that role, I did a lot of going into communities, giving presentations on what this law is, even more importantly, what it isn't, and really had a firsthand look at the level of misinformation and misunderstanding that is still out there. I cannot tell you how many times I heard people say that they think zoning is the same as eminent domain, They think it's a mandate to build. I can't tell you the number of times people said the state is, if their property was within the proposed district, said the state is taking my land, they're gonna bulldoze my single family home and build a skyscraper. So I think an interactive tool like the National Zoning Atlas is a really great way to kind of have a little bit of a reality check, help people understand what zoning actually is, that it's a playbook for the future, and that it is very often quite disconnected from what we actually see on the ground. There's plenty of communities where there's old multifamily building that was since downzoned, and if it, God forbid, burned down to the ground today, you would not be able to build it again. Similarly, there are single-family homes that have since been upzoned, but that property hasn't turned over or no one has chosen to take advantage of that zoning, so you wouldn't necessarily even know that it's zoned for multifamily housing. Another real value I see in this is the approach we took in our program was a cohort approach where I combined planners, 5 or 6 communities each, into cohorts of comparable communities that shared similar characteristics. And it was one of the, I would say, the most popular and adored part of the program because these planners felt so much, one, just emotional connection to one another and their shared struggles, but also really an opportunity to learn from one another, see what was working in other communities, recognize that they were facing similar obstacles. And so they loved hearing what other communities are doing, how they were approaching it. And so a tool like this, where they can easily go and see, what is our neighbors doing? What is that town that maybe isn't right next door but shares a lot of our same challenges and opportunities doing? And then to be able to look to other states and see what changes they're making and really be able to take some inspiration from that without having to do all the digging you would have previously had to do. You sort of did all that legwork for them. And I know that they'll be very grateful for that. It's also a real temperature check for how well this law is being implemented, because it is a lot harder to effectively implement good policy than it is to write good policy. This has been an incredible effort over the last many years, but particularly the last 3 or 4 years, by hundreds of people at the state. Municipal planners, state level employees, consultants, advocates like Jesse and myself, the list goes on. And the fact that it took as much effort as it did to make what is ultimately a relatively modest advancement is something that we really need to recognize and take into consideration. We might not have necessarily gotten all the results we hoped and dreamed for, but the amount of effort that had to go into just accomplishing what we did was immense, and we really can't. A lot of planners have taken some serious beating from this process. I have seen, in the 84 communities I've worked with in the last 2.5 years, I would estimate, I recently did a rough count, about 40% of them do not have the planner today that they had 3 years ago. That's a huge problem. And a lot of those planners are going into the private sector. They're going into consulting, they're going into development, because they just can't take the bullying anymore. I mean, people are being followed to their cars, cornered in their offices, verbally harassed. People have had to take restraining orders out against some of their own residents. So I think we really need to recognize the work that planners are doing, really uplift that and find any possible way to support them, because they are being put through the ringer, and we will continue to lose really, really good planners if we don't give them the support that they need to implement these really important laws that I strongly believe in, but recognize are not as easily said, as easily done as they are said. Additionally, I think it's worth noting the challenge presented by the town meeting structure of government that dominates in Massachusetts. Many of those other states do not have that. So town by town by town, we're trying to convince this huge swath of people, most of whom don't really understand what it is they are actually voting on, and don't, show up for the night of town meeting, kind of walking in blind and just being like, oh, you're my neighbor, I like you, you're voting no? Okay, I guess I'll vote no too. So there's such a need for public education when you have that structure of government. You're not just targeting a 10-person city council, you're targeting potentially 1,000+ people across town, most of whom, like I said, don't know what zoning even is. And there's still so much work to be done to destigmatize multifamily housing. There are still many people who think that renters aren't residents, who think that people who live in multifamily housing are this scary other that are going to come in, destroy the character of their town, bring more crime, bring more special needs students to the public school districts, and drain all the resources. There's still an incredible amount of stigma towards people who live in multifamily housing. So we've really been focusing in our efforts, our education and advocacy efforts, to demonstrate that across the state, 1 in 2 renters and 1 in 3 homeowners cannot afford their current housing costs. And when we're talking about increasing the housing supply, we're talking about your kid's favorite kindergarten teacher, we're talking about your favorite local business owner who can't find or retain any of their workers because none of them can live close enough. We're talking about your older neighbor who's lived in town her entire life and just wants to be able to downsize and stay in the community that she loves so much. We're talking about the neighbors and the people that we already really value and love, in addition to new residents who will bring new wonderful opportunities and values to the community as well. So the good news is I feel like the MBTA Communities Law has triggered conversations in communities that we really haven't had in 50 or 60 years since the Great Downzone of the 1970s. And so I do see this, while it is a very modest step forward in terms of actual zoning change and potential increased capacity, I do think it represents a real sea change in terms of the conversation we're having at the local level. I really do think this involved a level of outreach and public education that we have not done in a very, very long time. And I do think that's important, and that really is where it starts, is starting to shift people's hearts and minds around the value of multifamily housing in their community, and really seeing this as an opportunity to plan for the future, because we spend so much time talking about all the things that we don't want. And the metaphor I always use is that if we think of our community as a garden, many folks see zoning as like a weed killer, but they're so busy trying to kill the weeds, they end up killing all of the flowers as well. And I really want us to shift to a place where we're thinking about cultivating the kind of housing we want to see, rather than just thinking about what we want to avoid. So thank you for having me.
So we're going to open it up now for comments and questions. We have a microphone in the right side of the room, my right, your left. So if anyone has questions or comments about the Atlas, about our findings, please ask them.
So thank you, everybody. Really interesting. So I'm really curious about sort of the hearts and minds aspect of it, because a lot of people have done really, really well with this housing crisis, and a lot of them are pretty sympathetic characters. You know, I mean, I'm thinking about the grandma who's had her house since 1962, and that's her one source of something to pass on to the next generation. I'm thinking about in Chelsea, where I currently live, where they're afraid of the apartment building that doesn't have what they perceive to be adequate parking in an already very densely developed area. I'm thinking about Western Mass, where I also spend a lot of time, where, you know, they're all for housing affordability, but a lot of green out there, a lot of trees, and they're for the affordability, but not necessarily the density. Now, some of these concerns, I think, are more, you know, probably more warranted than others, and a lot of them are more sympathetic than others. But regardless, there has to be some way to get people to make the concessions for the broader good, which I think most people will do. Otherwise, we're going to be in these pitch battles with our planners or with the MBTA community, all of the sort of kerfuffle that we've seen. How do we win the ground game to win those people over who are, again, not the sort of deep-pocketed bad actors, but the good people who just don't want to give up what they've scrapped for?
Yeah, I mean, I can just briefly address that. I know Lily has a lot to say on that here in Massachusetts, but given the national, and I know we only have a few minutes, but given the sort of the national frame that we're seeing, we have actually seen that data can help change and inform people's understanding of how this important power works in their communities. Certainly in Connecticut, so the Desegregate Connecticut Coalition was very much powered by the data from the Connecticut Zoning Atlas, and we produced town-by-town one-pagers. We produced issue briefs on environment and economy, and they just did one on public health as well, and zoning's role in all of that using the Connecticut stats. So just to zoom out big picture and tie this back to the data question, I do think, I mean, again, I'm a professor. I have to believe that information helps people make better decisions. And so I do think that we have seen this tool work in other places to do exactly what you said. But the battles are real, and certainly in Connecticut, very similar to Massachusetts. It's definitely what we saw.
Yeah, I mean, I think in my own experience, I live in the city of Boston, when you see discussions over individual developments, people generally don't have a very good sense of what zoning really does in a lot of places, that it doesn't actually facilitate, to what Lily said, the kind of current built environment. It facilitates much less than the current built environment. So the fact that people like their neighborhoods and like their neighbors suggests that zoning reform would actually facilitate the continuation of the neighborhood they have. And as someone I know once said, you can kind of, if you resist zoning change in a world of increased demand, your neighbors will change, right? People will move in who can afford that more expensive housing. So if you want to kind of keep your neighborhood composition similar, development can actually do that, and reforming to zoning do that. So actually be able to visualize that, I think, is important.
And I'll just add, too, that I spent 7 years as chair of the City of Hartford's Planning and Zoning Commission, where we actually did an overhaul of the 1950s era zoning code, threw out the old code, brought in the new code. It was a unanimous vote in one night for the major capital city. And the reason for that was because of just a relentless conversation between the 10 members of the Planning Commission that were built up during my tenure from a smaller commission that was underpopulated to a full, robust commission of community engagement. And actually, that's why I wrote the book that I wrote. It starts with a conversation with Denise Best, one of the important neighborhood leaders who had not connected zoning with conditions she was seeing in her very low-income neighborhood. We have another question.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Alex Pratt. I'm an MPA student at Suffolk. I'm also the new director of planning in Malden.
Good.
Yes.
Good job. You guys led the pack.
Well, yes and no. So I was very excited about this tool. I think it will be very helpful with all the caveats that we know about Massachusetts politics. And I think just the way that politics works today with people believing their own sources of information rather than the source of information. But that's a whole other conversation. But I really appreciated how you put Malden's success in context, because when you look at that slide, when you say, "Oh, look, Malden, is upzoned as much as anyone," well, that may be true, but it's in many places where there's already new multifamily development, so the actual number of units created from that are probably not reflected in that first figure. And I think what we're seeing is that a lot of communities like ours are going through and having this conversation that maybe is not where it will be 10 years from now, but it's certainly not where it was 10 years ago. In Malden, even 5 or 6 years ago, affordable housing was anathema to what the city council wanted. And it was just really heresy to say that you wanted to build even affordable housing for Malden residents, let alone market rate housing for everybody. And so then we moved towards doing more inclusionary zoning in the last few years, and we have made some progress. But then there's a question of, is our inclusionary zoning making it harder to build market rate? And what is that right threshold? And how do we make sure that everyone has a chance to live in our communities without only building $3,000 apartments? There's not an easy solution. The work that Jesse and Lily are doing and their organizations are doing are absolutely a part of the solution to that. It's slow going, and I think unlike many things, zoning is the thing where everyone is fine with it the way it is until it really becomes a crisis, and then it takes 20 or 30 years once you put in the new zoning for it to really make an impact in a big way. So it's a really, I guess in that way it is like climate change, but it is a slow-moving vehicle that when you finally have the substantial critical mass of folks to say, actually, no one can afford to live in my community anymore and it's a problem, you're probably 15 years too late if you want to have an impact today. So having the work we're doing today will have an impact, 10 and 15 years from now. And that's a challenge. But I think that the work here from the NZA is very helpful. And I am excited and nervous to go back and look at my community with the NZA and share that with staff and stakeholders. And I do have a question, which is the point that you were just making, John, about what's already built versus how it's zoned and how do we preserve our communities. There's been some conversations in Cambridge and other communities about looking at where is all of this housing around us illegal to be built today? Could you build this neighborhood today? And it's kind of right fit zoning or right sizing zoning to build the neighborhoods that we already have to preserve our neighborhood character and kind of turn that argument against, turn that argument around. And so I'm wondering if there's a way for this tool to be paired with data that we have, either in our GIS systems or partnering with the NCA to show actual use as well as zone and put those two things together and see where they are in conflict. Because my guess is in most of Massachusetts, they are in conflict. Thank you so much.
Yeah, we would love to do an analysis once we wrap up our MBTA communities after zoning. We'd love to do that exact analysis, not only using that zone capacity index tool to show what is possible with zoning on the books, but also to then layer on top of that an as-built analysis, because I do think that would inform the state, the legislature, the governor in thinking about what to do next. And I think Jesse, Lily both, raised the points about this compliance piece and enforcement piece. Massachusetts has done two different models of state law so far. First, a declaration that I guess the ADUs, there was not necessarily the same kind of reporting back and verification as there is with the MBTA Communities Act. Is one better than the other? Well, I just showed you the ADU provisions in local law. They're not going to necessarily get updated. So how do we break this logjam? And this potential that we break the logjam with a totally different model of zoning than 352 different jurisdictions. Jonathan.
Hi. So I think, having worked on this project, I absolutely, support changing this zoning and, setting this foundation. But I guess something I'm skeptical about and I think is important is, and as we've talked about, the sort of the paper compliance that happens in some of these instances, just looking at the density and how so many communities are already built out where we would want multifamily. How do we kind of, what are some other policies or other things we need to do to kind of build that gap between the policy and actually getting the units that we're looking for? Are there other things that might be done in that respect?
Yeah, zoning's not the only thing. I think that's your point, maybe, right? Zoning is just one part of it. I mean, on top of zoning rules, there are lots of other things. And I know you're a historic preservationist, so there's historic preservation regulations in many communities. There's environmental reviews. Of course, there's funding issues. How do you get that first startup funding? If it's city-owned land or state-owned land, how do you go through the process of facilitating that transfer to private development or ground leasing it for affordable housing? And I think there's a lot of different legal questions. Our piece is just the zoning piece. I don't know if you have anything
Yeah,
to
I
add
would
on
say
that.
though too, which ties into the last question. When you compare the zoning to the built environment, not only are you able to see where there's nonconformities, things that were built not compliant, but you can also see where there's like soft sites where development is possible. And I think, going forward to kind of be able to use that data in combination would help reforms to better target places where development will actually occur, which I think is your question, where is the reform actually going to result in just paper compliance, or are the laws measured in a way that actually create more potential of capacity at places where development is actually going to occur based on what we've seen in the past?
I encourage
So I
you
think that's
also
the
to
more
look at,
sophisticated way to do that.
yeah, I also encourage you to look at the report that we issued with the Regional Plan Association on New York City and sea level rise. And because we did exactly that. They looked at soft site analysis, layered it with zoning, and I think that would be a good model. Thanks.
Hello, Elise Raposa with the Massachusetts Institute for a New Commonwealth, commonly known as Mass Inc. Big part of my job is studying housing in gateway cities. And one of the things we do is every year we ask them what % of their residential land is available for triple deckers by right, which is obviously the triple decker is kind of the quintessential gateway city housing style. And a lot, people would answer no, yes, which was a yes no question. Do you have at least 50% of your land by right for triple deckers? And people would answer no, even though technically on the books the answer would be yes,
Yes.
de jure, but de facto they responded no because of the dimensional requirements, because they're like practically no. And so I'm wondering, as you're thinking about developing this capacity index, how you're combining the de jure allowability with dimensional requirements to get at the de facto allowability. And also to get to the previous person's question, how you might think about addressing some of those dimensional requirements to kind of gently push towards increased density without going whole hog on some of the larger zoning changes. It seems like that might be more palatable to people who, like, I don't know, a lot of people don't like setback requirements, but they might not want a 20-unit building going up next door, you know?
So for the zone capacity index, we will be using a number of, so we have logged front setbacks, rear setbacks, side setbacks, height caps, building type requirements, lot coverage caps, parking requirements, and FAR, floor to area ratio, and much more. So we are the only group that has all of that at this scale, and so we are definitely going to try to figure that out. But that's really for that 4 and more family category. For triple deckers, the analysis I think will be much more simple. It's 3 units if it meets the dimensional requirements of the lot, the minimum lot size, and is it possible for something to be built within the setbacks? I was really looking at this index as just for 4 or more, but you raise a really interesting question about nonconformities, because we do have lot sizes in and we have a parcel layer for the entire country, so that could be pretty interesting. I'll just say that you're absolutely right. When we call jurisdictions sometimes to clarify, they'll say the opposite of what is on the books, because the planner has just sort of either administered the code in a certain way and never actually looked at the language. Our atlas shows what the language says, and so if it's allowed, it shows up. In the advanced filters, you can look at 3-family housing. You can see whether it's allowed or subject to a public hearing. You can look at the minimum lot size, whether there's a parking requirement, whether there's a height cap, and maybe 1 or 2 other things. But if that's where that advanced filters comes into play, you can check that out, and then you can at least do a preliminary scan yourself of where that's allowed.
Hi, my name is Marie Eisenberg. I'm a public housing resident in Wayland. And what I'd like to know is there any way to identify the types of ownerships of the properties, as in owner-occupied, corporate, whatever it is, family, whatever it is? And I would think that the type of ownership might determine some of the issues you might have to consider when it comes to persuading or being able to work with the people. So that's that.
Thank you so much. In some cases, some jurisdictions, we have seen pretty robust layers, especially about certain types of publicly owned land, state, city. New York City is an example of this. As for non-public entities, though, a lot of it is digging through land records. I know that my former colleague at Cornell, Linda Shai, did that. We were on a project where she was looking at all of the ownership structures for large buildings within New York City that were subject to sea level rise. And specifically, I tried to identify which ones were owned by co-ops. And that task was very monumental, and it really gave me some insight into how difficult that question might be, but it is a question we've been asked before, and maybe if we can find good sets of data, we could do an analysis of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think with that question and the last one too, layering this with other data sets would kind of enable you to see, because sometimes that ownership structure is going to affect the possibility of redevelopment, right, of a site, just like the setback requirements, well, these kind of more complex regulations. So, layering that together would also kind of help you to answer that question. And the great thing about the atlas is that it's valuable to the public to do that kind of work. Yeah.
I'm wondering if you can share more about the NZA's plans to keep the zoning updated. I see this as one of many places where town meeting has the advantage, right? Many municipalities can only update their zoning once or twice a year in Massachusetts compared to any time in other places. So that might make it more simple for the NZA. But what is the approach there? Since again, there's so many sources for zoning updates, and there's
This is a great question, and
so many.
certainly a question that we've tackled in a number of different ways in different jurisdictions. I'll point to California as a jurisdiction we have not even completed yet, but we've already secured funding for updating the state in 2026 because of the just massive number of statewide and local changes in California. In Massachusetts, we, again, thanks with the partnership with John and then our own team picking it up, we had finished the state analysis. And then the MBTA Communities Act, the jurisdictions started changing their laws, and we're like, oh my gosh, what are we going to do? Thankfully, in this case, the Bar Foundation came in with some supplemental funding. We were able to keep going. We had a couple of small private donations as well of Massachusetts interested parties that we'd had relationships with. So that was the way that we have now powered and will continue as we get our last remaining jurisdictions in to power this state. Looking forward beyond that, we keep our eye on large statewide changes like this one. And so we do try to, I'll give you just another example. New York City just redid their zoning ordinance, City of Yes. And all of those changes, it took me some time to raise the funds for our staff, because I guess people don't want to just read zoning codes all day for free, right? You have to pay people. We raised some money for a bit of time for our analysts to do that update from the fund for the City of New York. So it's like a colossal effort to keep some of that going, and we are looking at some longer term strategies, including partnerships with the American Planning Association to build a planner's portal. Trust me, I think, we will be hearing in the next, I don't know, let's call it day, the next few weeks from planners that looked at the atlas, and city planners say, wait, did you get this right? Wait, can you tell me how you did this? And so we will get some, or hey, we just rezoned, and we'll continue to do that in Massachusetts. Those piecemeal updates we tend to log pretty quickly. Albuquerque just sent us one that's a larger one. We just did that one, just whoever might have time in our analyst team. But it's definitely a long, bigger term thing, especially as we get jurisdictions completed.
Yeah, the Attorney General's office reviewing zoning makes for cities in Massachusetts makes it a little bit easier to flag some of those.
Does.
Yeah,
Yes.
So that's one advantage.
Hi, I'm Mitch Fallon with Housing Forward Massachusetts. Thank you for this presentation, first of all. It's been interesting to hear how untenable it can be to work with 352 jurisdictions managing zoning. Town meeting can be difficult. And I'm curious, since this is a national project, has a few states already checked off the boxes, are there any forms of government or jurisdictions that have been more effective or efficient at meeting the housing or zoning needs of their communities, whether that's at county levels or anything that's a little bit more innovative?
That's a hard, there's so many different types of communities at so many different scales. So success in a rural community will mean different than success in a large city. I'll actually point you to a homegrown example, which is Cambridge. They've recently redone, I don't know if that's a good example, maybe, yes. 62% of their land is zoned for multifamily housing by right. There's a bunch of other restrictions that will sort of soften that. No skyscrapers in Cambridge, certainly. But you do have some, especially through these processes that Jesse and Lily were talking about. You have communities thinking here in the state about how to move forward. So I'll just mention Cambridge, and then I'll actually point out Hartford too, as a larger city, 125,000 people, all housing. When 2016 is when we adopted the code. All housing is as of right. There are no minimum parking mandates. The first city to lift those citywide for all uses. We did a lot of great things in that code, but also added things like the tree canopy, which is really important in a city that has destroyed its own tree canopy, despite being one of the wealthiest and most treed cities in the country 100 years ago. So I'm a big historic preservationist. I like, thinking about what cities were and how they've changed and what might be. And I think the Hartford zoning code is really a path to housing development and sustainable development that does speak actually back to the Hartford of 100 years ago and how it was, I think, just the kind of walkable, sustainable, beautiful place that people who live in Hartford now still deserve.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing we don't do enough in the United States is look outside of our borders. So, I mean, not that necessarily other countries have done things better, but there's a piece of American exceptionalism in our land use. Well, two pieces. One is the dedication to the single-family home, which is not the norm in most parts of the world, but also the dedication to local and even sub-local control of zoning. We don't really have regional governmental structures that can think about this regional housing issue. We have states that are slowly intervening in some cases, but not necessarily doing so as effectively as they can, or not as aggressively as they can. And so I think there's a collective action problem here that low levels of government are just not suited to address. Yes.
My name is Yiming Wu. I work for the Boston Planning Department, the Urban Design Division. My question is for all of you. So I would love to hear more about some success stories about how people have used this tool for zoning reform education, as something that I know my department is thinking broadly about for our initiatives.
Yeah, I mean, so we've just finished up, or at least last few MBTA jurisdictions remaining, but I think it remains to be seen how you'll use it. And so I'm excited that you're here and are interested in doing that. For some big cities, they've used it to, so just thinking about, the Boston example, the mayor of Phoenix used the zoning atlas in a statement that she made, unbeknownst to us, we were not contacted by her, where she waved around the zoning atlas so proverbially and said, the suburbs need to step up because the zoning atlas just showed all of you that you're not producing enough housing in and around Phoenix. So from a big city perspective, that really became the big city mayor leadership pushing the suburbs to say, the atlas is showing that you have not stepped up. We've also seen the atlas used in analysis and city plan documents. So Boston, by the way, is a wonderful example of a city, and you may know that I wrote a report on the city of Boston zoning specifically, hundreds of districts in its 42 square miles. Is that about right? Land square miles. And in our zoning map, we have with the base districts and the overlays what we call slices and different combinations of slices. San Francisco has 11,000 different combinations of overlays and base districts. So people say, oh, this is a hard jurisdiction. New York has about 3,000, and Boston, I think, is the next biggest city in terms of, even though New York City is almost, it's 10 times the physical size of Boston. Boston is right behind it in terms of slices. So I think the main thing I would do, I would certainly wave it around and tell the suburbs to step up, as we know that it might happen. I think the main thing I would do, as I advised in that particular report for the city of Boston, was simplify the code. All of these neighborhood-specific zoning codes with neighborhood-specific definitions for apartments that just need one code. City of Chicago did a rezoning, I think, in 2007, where they threw out their old code. Boston was thinking of doing it, but I think the mayor pulled it back. So that's what I would say here in the city. Just make your code, give yourself a 250-page cap. That's all you need. You can actually cut and paste the Hartford code. Believe it or not, the districts would translate pretty easily and call it a day. Don't pay any consultants.
So one of the things, I do a lot of research on the early history of zoning. Zoning codes, when they were originally written, including for large cities, were 16 pages long. I mean, you look at it's just kind of, it's like a barnacle, or zoning code, or accretion of barnacles, which is a good metaphor in Massachusetts. Over time, just adding layers and layers. I mean, we're in 3 zoning districts right now, or like 3 different districts interact. Like, it's too much.
Might be
too
more
much
than 3.
complexity. Yeah.
Okay.
Other final questions? Well, thank you all so much. I want to thank Sara again for joining us, Lily and Jesse as well for their comments, and all of you for your questions. And please explore the Atlas, make use of it, share comments and thoughts on it, share it with your neighbors. It's always good to talk about zoning with your neighbors. And please hang out and enjoy some food, and happy to talk more. Thank you.
Thank you, John.